Hey everyone, National Master Sean Lei here, and I have some exciting news because on February 6th, this Saturday, I had the opportunity to play for the University of Toronto on the 4th board in the Kasparov Foundation Chess Cup, University Cup. And so, how well did I do? I'll be showing you within the next 5 days the 5 games I played and show you the wins or maybe losses that I've had playing this tournament. Alright, let's get straight into it. Alright, so for the first round, I had to play against a player from the University of Georgia Institute of Technology, and my opponent began with pawn to e4. Now, if you know my channel, you guys already know what opening I decided to play, even at this level, against a strong opponent. I decided to play pawn d6, the philidor defense. Why? Because it is the opening I'm most comfortable with, and I know I can do well. And so here my opponent played pawn d4, makes the most sense. I played knight f6, attacking e4. He defends, and I play knight bd7. Again guys, this is all from my philidor videos. You guys already know what to do. If you guys can basically tell me, or tell yourself while watching this video, what moves I am playing, I think you guys can do very well there. So here, pawn e5, my opponent played bishop e2, and as you guys know, when your opponent moves the bishop, you move the bishop to e7. When your opponent castles, you castles. This is just all very simple chess. And so here my opponent plays pawn h3, and again, I just decide to play pawn c6. Pawn c6 has a very simple idea. We're just going to go for b5, b4. And if my opponent is unaware, if he plays something like this, and I play here, and he plays something like this, all of a sudden I can gain a great advantage because I can do here, he moves the knight back, and we can take on e4, and we're up a pawn. And so that's, well, first of all, this is what we call the crab formation I really like in the philidor, and it's very strong because it's all about taking advantage of the center. However, here my opponent decided to play, instead of rook e1, he decided to play pawn to d5. And if you've checked out my philidor videos, you know that I frown upon pawn d5. And whenever your opponent plays pawn d5, sure it gains space, but what else does it do? And if you really think about it, all it does is create weaknesses in this position. And so in this position over here, you have many different options that you can do. You can capture, and if he captures back, you can always decide to play moves like pawn a6, pawn b5, bishop b7, knight b6, all attacking this new weakness on d5. And one thing that's good about this type of position is the opponent's knight can't move to allow the c-pawn move up to defend the d5 pawn because this pawn is hanging. And in these type of positions, you could also go for like knight e8, pawn f5, pawn f4 ideas, pawn g5. You gotta go for a lot of kingside, king's Indian setup like structures. So there's a lot of different ideas here, and black has already equalized whenever your opponent plays pawn d5. So here I decided to play a little bit of a tricky move. I decided to play knight c5. And knight c5 already nets black an advantage. And I want you guys to think, why does this net black a pretty decent position? And so the reason is quite simple. My opponent has a very big weakness, and if you guys know in the philidor, the e4 pawn is generally a big weakness in these positions. And the reason why is because, well, nobody is supporting it. And here my opponent makes a mistake. I want you guys to think, if you're playing on the white side in this position, what would you play in this position to try to defend your e4 pawn? Or should you defend your e4 pawn at all? Should you play a move like pawn b4? I don't know. Take a second, think about what you would have played in this position. See if you would have made the same mistake my opponent made. And so here my opponent made a pretty big mistake. Instead of capturing, instead of playing knight d2, which is the best move in this position, even though it looks very weird and still not very good for white because again his center pawns are very weak, my opponent decided to play bishop to d3. So why is bishop d3 automatically losing in this position? Take a second and think. I'll give you 5 seconds. 5 seconds? 4 seconds? That sound you just heard was probably just, well, was my cat. She just walked into my room. So while that was happening, I want you guys to think about what move you would play in this position to take advantage of your opponent's mistake. And so the move is pawn takes d5. And the reason why pawn takes d5 is so strong is because your opponent has to capture back one way or another. And if they capture back like this, then you can play pawn e5. And you just push through. Now you might think, oh, there might be a counterattack your opponent can do, pawn b4. Well, but the problem is pawn b4 is met when knight takes d3, captures, captures, and we're still up a piece. Alright, I'm gonna show you guys my cat. She keeps disturbing me. Here's my cat. Say hi. Oh, she's not very happy. She's a Scottish fold. It's very cute. But anyways, back to the chess game. Alright, let me put her down. Alright. And so in this position over here, my opponent decided to capture with the knight, but this still leads to the same issues. Knight captures there, pawn captures, and pawn e5. Well, and so after pawn e5 in this position over here, my opponent is stuck. He can't play b4 because again we have this in-between move, take here and then take there. So they decide to play bishop e2 and let me capture the knight. So now comes the next part of our plan. When you're up material, you should already know what to do. And when you're up material, you should always strive to trade off the pieces, limit your opponent's counterplay, and then try to promote a pawn. And we'll see how well I execute this in the next few moves. So in this position, the bishop goes over there, and I decide to play bishop f5, developing my pieces, because when you are not developed, that gives your opponent the most opportunity to take advantage, even if they're down material, because material not developed is not material at all. And so here my opponent plays pawn b4, and in this position I could have played bishop f6, but I was thinking, why give my opponent counterplay? There's no need, so I just moved the knight back. Just playing simple chess. My opponent plays bishop f4, and I just played rook to c8, attacking the c2 pawn. Now one thing I want to note in this position is you don't really want to allow your opponent to just play pawn c4. If your opponent just plays pawn c4 in these type of positions, well, even though he's down a piece, this center might look kind of scary. So rook c8 does a good job of preventing that. My opponent played rook c1, obviously defending the pawn, but also threatening c4. So I want you guys to think, this is just a positional move, not a tactic whatsoever. What move would you play here? There's two ideas that kind of make sense here. And if you thought of rook c4 or knight b6 being the move I played, good job, give yourself a pat on the back, because this idea is very simple, we're just stopping our opponent from getting counterplay. So here my opponent played rook e1, and I just moved bishop to g5, saying, hey, let's trade off pieces. Sure, oops, spoilers. Sure, bishop f6 was probably very good as well, but I just want to trade off pieces. My opponent captures, I capture back, and now I'm threatening some, maybe pawn, bishop takes h3 as well. My opponent plays king h1, getting out of that, and I decide to just move my rook here with ideas of maybe, for example, if my opponent plays a3, I can play rook h4, and I have a lot of cool ideas. Let's say they play queen e2, we have bishop takes here, and this is really cool because that is checkmate. However, my opponent was on to me. He just played rook e3, and I'm just like, you know what, if you give me a free pawn, who am I to deny taking the free pawn? And so in this position, my opponent plays bishop e2, obviously trying to play c4, and I could have played rook c8, but there might be some problems because of the back rank. And one thing I've talked to you guys about in my beginner videos is that, once you're ahead, you usually should play like moves like pawn h6, pawn g6, maybe pawn f6 in order to not get back ranked. Like you don't want something like this happening. If this happens in your own game, well, this is an opportunity for you to go cry. And this has happened to me in the past before, so I don't want any of this to happen to you guys. So here, I just play bishop g6 and say, keep my pieces safe. He plays pawn c4, I play queen f4, rook f3, and I just put my queen on a better square than g5 since the job is finished. The king moved to h1, I'm just going to put it near the center. My opponent plays bishop to d3, and I move my queen to h4. I say, hey, if you want to trade off bishops, I'm down. And my opponent says, yep, let's trade, and now my back rank problems are no more. So, queen to d3, and I just take the pawn for free, and my opponent says, let's not trade off pieces, because the more pieces traded off, the better it is for me. Now here, I'm like, okay, let's just win a lot of pawns. I take pawn with tempo, my opponent plays queen over there, and I decide to play pawn a6. Now, you might be thinking, what in the world, pawn a6? Well, the idea of pawn a6 is quite simple, my opponent's attacking my pawn, and I don't want him to gobble this, gobble that, maybe get a running h-pawn. This might be a little bit dangerous, so I just played pawn a6 and said, well, what are you going to do? Your queen can't invade because this knight's doing a good job protecting all these squares from my opponent. As you guys know, knights in the center are very good, and my rook here is defending the knight. The queen is defending the rook, and my pieces all have pretty good synergy with one another. Only this rook is kind of useless, but we'll try to improve it in the future. So here my opponent plays queen there, attacking d6. I decide to play rook f4, say, yo, let's trade pieces. He says no, so I'm very sad. And in this position, I just take on f2. So, after I take on f2, I'm surprised my opponent did not take on d6. This is the move I was expecting because it gives him a little bit of counterplay. But here I could always play moves like probably just knight f6 and I'll probably be fine. So, however, my opponent decided to play rook g4 instead. After rook g4, I just move my queen back to f6, defending this, defending that, and only my knight is hanging now. My opponent plays king h2, rook f1, saying let's trade. He says no. I say let's trade again. He says no. And I say, okay, time to develop my last piece. And so this rook, even though it wasn't developed, now it is, and it's going to c2, in which maybe we can do have two piggies on the 7th, just eating everything on the 7th row. So my opponent plays queen b3, just saying I'm attacking your knight, and I'm like, oh no, let's trade off pieces. Now here I kind of made a mistake. For some reason I thought he can only take here, which is what he did. But I thought to myself, maybe my opponent can take on b7, and that's a lot of counterplay my opponent gets here, because I can't really take here because he can take there, and this is not good because I'm getting mated here. So that would be a terrible end. However, if this were to happen, I would just have to make a move like knight f6. Sure, his rook can come down here, but after everything, you know, I can take here, and this is probably still winning. Well, definitely still winning because I'm up so much material. So nothing to be scared of there. He takes my knight, I take there. I play rook c8. The reason why you don't want to play rook here is because, again, you will get mated and you will be very sad. So, of course, I looked at my opponent's threats. I said, nope, I'm just going to move my rook here. My opponent plays rook to g3. I play rook f1, threatening mate in 1. He acts to exchange. I take and find the final move, you guys. If you guys guessed rook e2, that is correct. And that is my first game against the Institute of Technology from University of Georgia. So, I'm 1 out of 1. How well will I do in the next few games? We'll see. In third round, I play against a GM. Will I do well, or will I crumble under the pressure? Alright guys, I'll see you guys in the next video. Hope you enjoyed.